My suspicion, and I have no direct evidence for this, is Mexico is sitting on 100,000 or hundreds of thousands of migrants going, are you really going to deport people to us? Because we'll just open these deportation centers. Are you really going to put tariffs on our stuff? Because we'll just open these deportation centers. Mexico have... This is partly why America has really not taken out any kingpins in the last 4 or 5 years. Because the Mexicans have told them not to, and have said, if you want to take out kingpins, we'll let migrants in.
The opinions of the guests and host are their own and do not represent the opinions of Ironclad, the Border Patrol, or the Department of Homeland Security.
We cut through the partisan talking points. We're not interested in perpetuating fear. We're interested in seeking truth, hearing what's really going on America's borderland. Welcome to Borderland, an Ironclad original. Our next guest is Benjamin T. Smith, who is a historian and a professor who focuses on the Latin American studies. This guy was awesome. He also is an author of a book called The Dope, The Real History of the Mexican Drug Trade. I enjoyed this conversation. He was fascinating, a very intelligent person on the subject. I think you guys will love it. Hope you enjoy. Well, Ben, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us in Borderland. Your background and expertise in the Latin American studies and as well as Mexican history, but more so the history of the dope world in Mexico, I find fascinating. I want to hit you real quick with this one. What led you to even want to do research in the Mexican drug trade?
Honestly, I didn't turn up to Mexico thinking that's what I was going to do. I turned up late 1990s, early 2000s. Mexico was an incredibly optimistic, vibrant place. There was an amazing culture, film industry, the Zapatistas. They were on tour when I turned up. So that's kind of why I turned up. Indigenous rights, politics, left-wing politics. But gradually, over the time I was there, it became very obvious that something else was going on. It wasn't just a kind of positive story going on in Mexico, and there were large levels of violence, and they were not simply occurring in areas that you might expect it, like up in heroin fields or in the kind of marijuana fields of the Sierra Madre, right? These things were happening. I mean, my extended family comes from Oaxaca, which is, I'm sure many of your listeners know, is a kind of indigenous, a very strongly indigenous city. Lots of traditions down in southern Mexico, not famous for anything to do with narcotics. But in 2013, I was there, and the Zetas rolled in, and immediately tried to extort every bar in the city, including my local pub. I mean, as a Brit, I kind of had my local pub. The owner refused to pay, a friend of mine called Oliver, and the Zetas just blew him away. And I suppose it was an eye-opener. It made me realize that a lot of this violence was not just being meted out to people who were involved in anything to do with the drug trade. This guy just ran a bar and refused to pay extortion money. So I suppose that was the thing that kind of pushed me into it. And the second thing that pushed me into it, about in the next 2 years, I kept being approached by lawyers from the US side of things who were saying, we've got tens of thousands of Mexicans who are fleeing drug violence, places like Guerrero, Michoacan, Sinaloa. They're all coming over to the border and they're asking for asylum, and we've got no one to help them. So I started to basically work on a pro and low bono basis, kind of helping out asylum seekers getting asylum in the United States. And I suppose that also gave me a real insight into just how prevalent the violence was in particularly in rural areas of Mexico.
Crazy. So that's when it starts. So that's when you decided to transition further into focusing on that subject particularly, correct?
Yeah, man. I was doing kind of, indigenous politics, market women. My wife's family are all market women, locatarias. So that's what I was kind of interested in. I was really interested in Catholicism as well. My wife's Catholic. My daughter's currently doing her art project on the saints. I mean, I love the kind of, beautiful, rich culture of Mexico. And it wasn't, it's not something it's not an avenue I wanted to go down, but I kind of felt impelled to.
So in The Dope, you described how Mexican drug trade started long before the 20th century. Can you give a brief history lesson on how that first started? How did a small community of driven production narcotics evolve into a larger scaled operation and organized crime?
Excellent. I'll cut down my 250-page book. Right. Okay. So in very brief, really briefly, there are two drugs that Mexico's always produced. The first is marijuana, which, in all frankness, was basically a soothing thing to smoke, mostly for people who were in prison or in the army. And it became quite popular in the late 19th century as something, basically, it was very difficult to smuggle alcohol into barracks or into prisons. So people instead smuggled marijuana. So it became a kind of prisoner drug, and an army drug. However, in 1910, there was the Mexican Revolution, and many people joined the army. So, peak 1914, there were about 250,000 Mexicans in the army, another 200,000 in kind of irregular guerrilla bands, and a lot of them used marijuana uh, as a kind of palliative to smoke when they were bored, but also if they had an injury. It was their version of opium, or morphine. It was the thing that helped if you had a wound or had an injury. So many of them used it for that. So that's how that kind of took off in Mexico. The other drug that Mexico's produced really from the 1920s onwards is opium, out of which you make morphine and heroin. Um, However, it was mostly initially Mexican Chinese people who started to produce opium, really just for Chinese smokers of opium. It was a really small industry in the kind of 20s, early 30s. But in the late 1930s, what happens is America is cut off from Asia because of the Second World War. And as a result, it can't import any opium or any morphine or any heroin from Asia or from Europe, actually. So as a result, in the late 30s, early 40s, Mexican farmers take over the growing of opium and the producing of heroin for this big US market. And that's really the beginning, kind of 1940 to 1945, when it really gets going.
I've never heard that in my life, but I did hear about the Mexican Chinese history before, so now that kind of ties in a little bit. And I've spent some time throughout, America finding some of the old Chinese opium dens while they're building kind of the railroad system.
Mm.
And so I've had heard of a little bit of the history there. So is that similar to where the Chinese Mexicans kind of come from? Is that area kind of that time frame?
Exactly the same time frame. So basically, I mean, I think our assumption is that America has just been racist towards African Americans and Latinos. However, it started off in the 1880s being very racist towards Chinese immigrants. And in 1882, it kicked Chinese immigrants out of America. Many of them come down to Mexico. Many of them build the railways in Mexico, in these kind of desert regions of kind of Baja California, Sonora, Chihuahua, and they end up there. And they take their tradition of opium smoking, which I think we think is, I mean, opium smoking has a very bad reputation, like basically doing any opiates. But for many Chinese people, it was like you or I having a whiskey at the end of the day or a glass
Yeah,
of red wine. I mean, it was
right.
basically a relaxant after a hard day's work. Many of them were not, very few of them were actually addicted. We now think maybe only about 3 or 4% were actually addicted.
Wow. Yeah. I think that's one of those cultural things that we see it differently. But
Mm.
yeah, those have definitely been used for many years. And I learned a little bit of the history of it. So it's pretty fascinating to hear that in Mexico it was prevalent as well.
Did,
Um,
did you ever did you ever
Please.
go to La Chinesca in Mexicali?
No, I haven't.
That's amazing, man. So Mexicali, if you've ever been there, it's so incredibly hot. So the Chinese built an underground city. So it's this network of opium dens, boarding houses, people's houses. It's this extraordinary network
Yeah.
that still exists away from the heat and also, frankly, away from the border patrol and away from customs.
Yeah, that's the same. If you go to there's a town called Pendleton, Oregon, that actually still has the same exact thing, an underground city that the Chinese built for opium dens, but as well as living conditions and as well as to evade any kind of like detection. And so it's a whole city, exactly the same thing you described, and same in Pendleton, Oregon. You have to check that out sometime.
I'm gonna have to take a note of that. Right. Thank you. Get a tour.
You noted that the early drug production is primarily from the local, medicinal use or whatnot. What factors drove the global to global proportions where the cartels adapted to these changes? Like, what made it go from that to boom, kind of what we see today?
Okay, there's kind of two big booms. The first boom, which is I kind of make the equivalent, it's like an oil boom or something, is marijuana in the 1960s. Basically, up to the 1960s, no one in America smokes weed. Very, very few Mexicans do. A handful of bohemian poets, but really very, very minimal. The 60s, as you know, counterculture, rock and roll, everyone starts smoking weed, and tens of thousands, probably even hundreds of thousands of Americans come down to Mexico and find out that there are a few places where they're growing weed already, and really encourage Mexican peasants to grow the stuff. So previously, I estimate somewhere between 40 and 50 small villages grew marijuana in 1960. By 1975, we're talking thousands of villages. So basically, there's a huge explosion. The second big explosion, and that I think creates the first kind of wave of, let's say, cartels or organized crime groups.
Right.
The second big explosion is Coke. It's massive, and it massively increases the amount of money that cartels are earning. It probably puts a zero on their earnings. They go from earning about 3 billion to about 30 billion by the end of the 90s. So, I mean, and it's the American Coke addiction. America is, in 1999, is taking 70% of the world's Coke, and 95% of that Coke is going through Mexico.
Yeah, it just goes through Mexico. Mexico is not producing it, right? This is still produced in like Colombia and stuff like that, correct?
It's produced in Colombia, but the Colombians come up with this really kind of smart deal. Basically, up to that point, up to about early 90s, the Mexicans are just basically charging $1,000 per kilo of cocaine. However, the Colombians, after the Americans start putting them in jail, don't want to take the risk anymore. So they say to the Mexicans, okay, you take over a kilo of cocaine, we'll pay you not $1,000, but another kilo of cocaine. Now, a kilo of cocaine is worth $25,000. So suddenly the Mexicans are earning 25 times as much money per kilo of cocaine. And that's the change.
And it meets the demand of what America is consuming.
Yep. I mean, that is the real law of Mexican drug production. Mexican produces what America wants, needs, demands.
That's what it's been, and that's how it still is.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, there's very, very little market. Mexico has started to get a market in drugs over the last maybe 20 years, but still things like fentanyl, which are obviously a horrible drug that is causing lots of problems in the United States, there's still a tiny market for that in Mexico.
Can you elaborate on the Silk Road and explain how the infrastructures play a role in the past and now current drug trade?
When you say the Silk Road, are you talking about the old Silk Road or the new, or the Silk Road as in the internet? The internet-based kind of trafficker of narcotics.
This happens is something you mentioned in the past. It says you mentioned that trade routes like the Silk Road help transform small-scale drug production into global industry.
Yeah, well, I mean, basically, that's the Chinese link. That up to that point, the Chinese, there is no Mexican opium production until the Chinese turn up in the 1910s, in the 1920s, and start producing the stuff. And they teach. I mean, I have these extraordinary documents I found where it was quite clear there was like one Chinese farmer in a village, and he was teaching all the Mexicans, like, this is how you do it, this is how you grow it, this is how you harvest it, this is how you mix it up. They started experimenting with putting like tequila and mezcal into the smoking opium to kind of flavor it for a Mexican audience. I mean, it's a classic kind of fusing of the two cultures, like Chinese on the one hand, Mexican on the other.
Has the Silk Road now become the internet?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, where do where do where does
The
where do the
information, right?
precursors come from, right? I mean, the most of the precursors come from China
Yes.
or from India, and they got through the internet, but they're also got through Mexican businessmen who are going over to China and buying this stuff, and also Chinese businessmen who are going over to Mexico. I noticed, and I don't know how much you follow this, but there's a particular variant of narco corridos called trapteño. You heard of this stuff?
Yes. Yes.
So like El del Mercedes. So if you see their videos, they often have like a random Chinese bloke in the back of the videos, and you're like, why is there? And it's a nod to the fact that that's where their links are now. It's all
Oh
about
man.
China.
There's so much to those corridos. There's so much in the culture of the narco culture that like they tell you everything in their own world. There's almost the notoriety behind telling their story.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Yeah, the whole Chinese connection right now is a big one that I'm curious because I've even heard there's a lot of Chinese businessmen purchasing a lot of land out in Mexico as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's two things, isn't it, happening? The first is the completely licit Chinese industry, which is
Yeah.
moving in throughout Latin America and is taking really the role that the United States used to play. So, I mean, San Luis Potosí, which is a beautiful city that I really love visiting, but it's like right on the other end, other side of the valleys, there's just like a massive Chinese car factory and almost a kind of parallel Chinese city that's been built, right? On the other hand, you're absolutely right. There's illicit Chinese trade, and we've known since the early 2000s the Chinese have been highly involved in selling precursors and even selling made fentanyl to the Mexicans.
How have political shifts within Mexico influenced the dynamics and power structures of the cartels?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I mean, one of the things that I discovered while researching this book is I think the assumption is that yeah, that basically governments fight cartels, governments fight organized crime. But in actual fact, the vast majority of governments, even the US government for many years, regulate organized crime. What do I mean by that? They basically take out some people that they think are too violent, aren't producing good quality drugs, or most importantly, aren't paying them.
Mhm.
The others, they get to pay 10, 20, 30% of their profits back up to the government. And so the government in Mexico since the 1910s has been taking a cut of narco profits, mostly local governments. So the most famous of which was this extraordinary guy who was like a revolutionary leader in the 1910s called Esteban Cantu, who ran like Baja California. And I mean, he made an entire education infrastructure, a road infrastructure. He put police on the streets. He got rid of bandits, basically through opium money, quite openly, right? He would take this kind of cash, but other governors as well. From about the 1970s onwards, the federal government, that is the federal police of Mexico and the army and the Secret Service, they took over control of the drug trade, particularly the coke trade. So there was this switch in the 1970s, and it was a pretty violent switch. So the federal cops started killing local cops because the federal cops wanted control. When I'm talking about federal cops, I'm talking about the Mexican version of the FBI basically took over control of the drug trade. Again, I think there's a tendency to think this is all conspiracy, but I mean, in my book, I'm not just quoting conspiratorially minded journalists, I'm quoting the Mexican Secret Service that is quite annoyed that they're not getting a cut of drug profits and the federal police are. So these are pretty, this is, as I say, this is not just the world of mad conspiracy.
It's crazy because the more interviews I get, I start to hear a lot of that. And one of the in particular was with Ed Cadron, who thought it was very concerning that when El Mayo was captured, you know, the government got involved in like trying to make decisions. And so it makes it seem as if like, hey, you affected somebody that is kind of protected within the government itself. And that's where you start to see there's corruption at the highest levels. And that's when you say things like this, it's like you just further validate it.
Do you know, I'm going to be a bit, I mean, I don't even think the word corruption is a terribly useful term, right? So corruption, think about corruption. I mean, every country has corruption. It's taking your and my tax money and then using it for private purposes. So it's taking public money and then, I don't know, buying a car or buying a nice dress for your mistress, right? That's corruption.
Yeah.
This is kind of not corruption because it's not taking public money. It's not taking tax money. It's taking narcos cash in order to not imprison them, right? So it's taking actually private money, and often, yes, often these politicians are corrupt. Often they spend it on a new house. Often they put it in Swiss bank accounts, but actually, often they also spend it on stuff the state needs. And we've got these extraordinary interviews with policemen going, well, the reason I was corrupt is because my entire police force had no uniforms, no cars, and no guns. What do you want me to do? So I had to go and take money off some drug dealers to put some other ones in jail.
Oh man.
Is that corruption?
So what do you call
or is
that?
Just policing?
Is that
Pardon? I don't know, man.
what do you call that? Yeah. Working
Good
the
policing.
working the system to your benefit.
Yeah.
It's Robin Hood. It's stealing from the rich, giving to the poor kind of concept.
Kind of. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's near a kind of banditry or something. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. So my question in your book, it dives into the influence of the U.S. anti-drug agencies in shaping Mexican drug trade. I'd love to hear more about that.
Right. So first things first is when I started this project, I thought, right, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to dive into the DEA's archive, right? Everyone knows the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Tres Letras, as they call it in Mexico. It's got this enormous reputation. So I turn up in actually Washington, D.C., ask where the archives are, and all the people in the American National Archives are just laughing. They go like, there isn't an archive. And they explained to me the DEA up to 1989 had its head offices above a strip joint in downtown DC. I shit you not. And then they lost the archive on the way to move it to the Pentagon. So there is no archive of the DEA, which I think perhaps gives you some insight into the nature of the DEA and the level of professionalism. The more I found, I did talk to a lot of DEA agents. They were, many of them, extremely actually pleasant to me, very kind to me. But I think one thing that the most honest of them realized that what they were effectively doing was putting very poor, mostly brown and black people in jail. And they were doing nothing to the supply of drugs. So they were very, very, the smart ones were really embittered by it and actually kind of rather tragic figures. Yeah, the DEA knows what it's doing. Effectively what the DEA is doing, and I'll give you the example of what's happening in Sinaloa now. Cartels are like closed, right? They're completely closed organizations. It's really difficult to get into a cartel and take it down. So what you need is an informer on the inside. So what the DEA would do is it would get somebody on the inside. In the case of Sinaloa, it seems to have got its teeth into the Chapitos and said, you've got to if we're going to go easy on you, you've got to rat out the other side of the cartel. So the Chapitos ratted out Mayo, and what the DEA does is then wedge open that division. And if you heard the US ambassador, he said recently, Ken Salazar said, what is happening in Sinaloa is fantastic. Well, tell that to the families of 300 dead people and 300 disappeared people. But the DEA doesn't, or the DEA and the US authorities think it's great because it frankly is narcos killing narcos. People's who, in their opinions, life has no meaning, has no value. So
Yeah, it's
they quite
crazy.
deliberately make these divisions. We assume that cartels divide because they all hate each other and are psychopaths. No doubt a lot of them are, but they mostly divide because the DEA deliberately divides them.
So the U.S.'s involvement creates more chaos.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, to be fair, on this occasion, I don't think it's the DEA. I think it's probably Homeland Security that did this. A mixture of
Really?
Homeland Security and Homeland Security and the FBI. That's the rumor that
When you
split.
say Homeland Security, that's such a broad. What is that? What is that? What kind of?
I mean, yes, it's the broad umbrella for Homeland, for Homeland Security. But there are people who deal in counter narcotics in that.
Let me ask this. So it brings me to this one. How has militarization on both cartels and government forces changed the dynamics of the drug trade?
It's made the military very rich. I mean, the military is something that virtually no one talks about in Mexico. People are terrified of it. We over the last 5 or 6 years, there's been an attempt to basically put together what's called a truth commission, a kind of a historical investigation into military crimes in Mexico over the last 50 or 60 years. And it came to a juddering halt within 3 days because the military simply will not reveal anything. The military in Mexico is so unbelievably closed that it's very difficult to get at. But in general, what we know is the military, over the last 6 years at least, has kept back from direct confrontation with the cartels. But if it has been pushed into direct confrontation, it shoots to kill, like any army does.
Yeah.
And it's not a police force. And to use it as a police force it's spectacularly irresponsible. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the news recently of what's going on in Culiacan. There was, I mean, at least 5 people seem to be shot dead directly by the military who were not unarmed, because that's what the military do.
We don't just do the filmmaking. We do everything. We've taken a case study of over 30 projects that we've done over the past 15 years, and we put together what we believe is the most effective and efficient content funnel for brands. They need content on a daily basis. They need to be talking to authentic end users. We want your team to bring its most challenging problems and allow us and our team to apply our proven methods to your brand to take it to another level.
It's also crazy watching some of the cartels have just as much firepower as the military.
I mean, that is a fundamental problem. I mean, if it's Mexican drugs killing Americans, it's American guns killing Mexicans. And I know that the Mexican government is.
I've never heard that. Yeah.
It's like Newton's third law of border crime, right? I mean, yeah, it's incredibly distressing. The Mexican government is now trying to run various law cases against U.S. gun companies. I suspect they'll be unsuccessful. I mean, shit, the parents of the victims of Sandy Hook were unsuccessful. So my suspicion is so will the Mexican government be. But I mean, I remember, and I'm sure you've traveled around Mexico, but early 2000s, no one had a gun. Right, there was one guy outside the main bank in Oaxaca City. Whereas I go to Mexico now, and most of my middle class friends have a pistol for self-defense, and anyone who's involved in any security forces have multiple different weapons, and all of them are imported illegally from the United States. If you want to get a gun in Mexico, this is mad. There is one solitary gun shop on a military base. That's the only way to get a gun in Mexico. It's impossible.
Yeah. And people still have them. So they're obviously getting them.
Everyone has them.
Yeah. Given that the communities have become economically dependent on drug trade, what would it take to provide an alternative economic opportunity for those at the bottom of like the cartel hierarchy?
It's a really good question. It's something I don't have huge amounts of time for the current regime, but it's something I think that AMLO, the former
Yeah.
president, and the Morena party have tried to do. They genuinely have tried to up the minimum wage. They've given out pensions to old people. These are, frankly, in Western terms, pretty low numbers, but they are really, they're life changing for old people and for their families in Mexican villages. So I think one of the policies that Morena is trying to do is basically suck the people right at the bottom out of poverty so they don't have to rely on the drug trade or joining the cartel in order just to make enough money to live. So I think there are efforts to do that. However, a fundamental problem is now organized crime in Mexico is not really only about drugs. It's about
Yeah.
a whole range of crime. So it's stealing fuel, it's kidnapping, it's human trafficking, a lot of it's just boring extortion. It's like, I don't know, it's like Sicilian mafia stuff. It's just pay me 10% of your taco stand.
Yeah.
And that is really, really difficult to eradicate. You could legalize all the drugs in the United States, and I'm not sure you would stop extortion or kidnapping in Mexico, sadly.
What's also fascinating is how some of the cartels, like the CJ&G, are recruiting based on it looks cool. Like the younger generation wants to just be a part of the cool crowd of it, which becomes a very scary difference. What you see kind of in American gang culture is more like poverty needed family to be a part of. But now the social media, the money, the girls, the lifestyle has become attractive to some that don't necessarily need to go into it, but they do because of that.
Yeah, it's something. I mean, I've talked to quite a few people who are on the kind of what you call like lower rungs of the cartel, so kind of low grade hitmen or something like that. And I think I completely agree. They are attracted by the glamour. They're attracted by yeah, the girls often. They're attracted by the fast cars. They're also attracted because these are people who generationally have have been right at the bottom of the hierarchy. And I think what we really underestimate when we try and understand the dynamics of what's going on is for many people who join up, it's kind of a form of class warfare. It's kind of, this is the first time in my village, no one's going to look down on me like they've looked down on my dad and my granddad and made them work for pitiful amounts of money. Now I can stand up to those people. I can stand up to the landowner, the doctor, the teacher. Basically, it is this kind of it's kind of brutal village class war. Don't want to get
Yeah.
all Marxist on you, but I think that is, I mean,
No,
so
I
yes, it's about the glam, but it's also about,
yeah,
frankly, take me seriously for once.
I've never heard it that way, and that's fascinating. And I think there's absolutely truth to that, which makes it even more scary.
Yeah, it kind of is because you've got these kind of little class wars going on in each community, right? Um, yeah, I mean that's what I see, and it's often the people in the kind of, let's say, the what you would call, what for us are obviously not very well off. So teachers, people who own
Yeah.
businesses, they're the ones who are, they are lower middle class, but in a village, they're the elite.
That's crazy because that's what the United States military for a while before the war was a big place for that to like change your economic social economic position. Just like now I'm gonna get dental, I'm gonna have a job, I'm gonna get
Yep.
put money in the first and 15th. For Americans, that's what it was. And then when the war kicked off, then you're like, now I might have to go to war, maybe not so much. You know what I mean? So it's different, but that's
Well,
very
I, I,
similar.
it is really similar. I mean, in Mexico, Mexico had two avenues for that. One was the military, which is now really miserable, and you don't get paid enough. I mean, there were very famously the Zetas. They are so cynical. The Zetas, a famous cartel. They they used to put signs outside military bases going, "Sick of your crap military rations? Come join the Zetas," and then have a big picture of a nice meal.
Wow.
So that avenue's kind of just not very good. The other avenue used to be teaching, but the teachers' unions in Mexico are super corrupt. So often in some areas of Mexico, to become a teacher, your parents have to have been teachers.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so that kind of narrow that, which means there's not that kind of escape for many people.
Yeah, and then how about law enforcement?
I mean, law enforcement is a ticket to a bullet in the head, in all
Yeah, it's
honesty.
scary.
I mean, it's really scary. What we're talking. I mean, these are official figures, 500 dead a year, but it's way more than that.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, there are a lot of the people that I deal with who are running to the US are former law enforcement who maybe went in there naively, or maybe they took money from the wrong cartel and then the new cartel moved in, but they're absolutely terrified. And the stories they tell, the cartels go hard against each other, but they really go hard against the law enforcement they think has betrayed them.
Man, is there law enforcement that isn't paid off, or almost everyone is?
So I'm always asked this by judges in asylum cases, and absolutely no doubt there are loads who don't take money, right? But they do have to look the other way. And if they go after the cartels, they're dead.
Yeah.
I mean,
That's
we know, for example, the places that I looked into the federal police, who were admittedly they were the drug police, so you might expect them to be a little bit more corrupt. But the estimate in 1999 from the CIA was 95% of the federal cops were on the take. Having said that, I also found out 40% of the DEA were on the take in the early 70s. So,
wow.
I mean, not maybe as much as Mexico, but still a lot of people on the take.
That's crazy. I'm excited to read your book, man. I'm excited
Oh,
to really dig into that thing, man. It's gonna be
cool.
awesome.
Cool.
Some advocates argue for decriminalization or legalization of certain drugs to counter the cartel influence. What kind of impacts do you think that would help?
Well, in all honesty, I mean, there are swathes of America where it is de facto decriminalized. I mean, Oregon has just regressed, but I mean, let's be frank. I mean, I lived in California for 6 months. It's
Yeah.
de facto decriminalized in swathes of California. Um, I'm not sure that does huge amounts, in all honesty. Now, yes, it doesn't put incredibly low-level drug addicts in prison, which is better than putting them in prison. I mean, you've had the problem with mass incarceration, which is
Yep.
absolutely scandalous. So, yes, better than putting them in prison. But in terms of, for example, regulating the drugs they take, it does no use. They're still dying so you really have to legalize. Now, even legalization, I think, is problematic unless it's done really seriously, because all you're going to do is you're going to get you're going to get the legalization that is happening with the marijuana market in Colorado, where basically middle class people can afford to go to their head shop and get primo weed, right?
Yep.
And poor people still can't get that stuff. So they're still buying on the streets and it's crap, and they're getting busted by the police. And my guess is if you, let's say, legalized heroin and cocaine, you'd still get that dual market. So here's my radical response, which actually is borrowed off this amazing Mexican doctor that I write about. He was this like anarchist doctor. He came up with the idea, don't just legalize it, the government should give it away free.
Whoa. Why is that? What would that help?
Because effectively, then you don't have that black market. You would price every single drug seller out of the business immediately. Because basically, no one wants to take drugs unless their life is on the slide. This was his thinking. So as a result, they're going to take drugs, whatever. We might as well give them their drugs. So as a result, they can then live a half-functioning life. They can go and do a job, right? They don't have to steal, and they don't have to buy really rubbish drugs off drug dealers. They can buy really high-quality stuff. Well, they can get high-quality stuff off us, which is a fate that. But I mean, I suspect it might be politically quite difficult to do.
That's wild.
There, I don't know. I'm allowed to say that from my ivory tower, you see.
Yeah, that's wild. Who said that? Who'd you get that idea from?
Yeah, so it's this amazing guy. He's like, his name is Leopoldo Salazar Viniegra. He was a crazy doctor, 1930s Mexico, total radical. Eventually, the DEA basically, the precursor of the DEA, basically forced the Mexican government to sack him. He's like in charge of drug policy. They forced the Mexican government to sack him. They then basically stop exporting morphine to Mexican hospitals. So all the Mexican cancer patients are dying in extreme pain. And then Mexico has to back away from this free drug experiment.
Crazy.
It's pretty brutal.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. Let me ask you this. What happens if Americans somehow stop purchasing drugs? We're able to get a hold of it. Does this truly affect the cartel, or do they find another way?
It's a really, really good question, and it's one that I'm not entirely sure that even security specialists in Mexico know. There are clearly some cartels, and I think what is going on in Sinaloa at the moment is fascinating. I think you've basically got possibly the end of the old school cartel. Mayo's end of that cartel is interested in narcotics, right? It used to be weed and heroin and coke. Now maybe it's fentanyl, but he basically isn't involved hugely in extortion. He makes sure that fentanyl is not sold on the Mexico side. That's part of the agreement with the government. I mean, that is everyone in Sinaloa, there are no overdoses from fentanyl, right? Which no one ever talks about, but there isn't, because they make sure they don't sell in their own backyard.
Yeah.
That's part of the agreement. So some people like Mayo, like these old school cartel people, I don't think they would be interested in going into other forms of organized crime. People like the Chapitos, I think they are. There was a very interesting letter that was written, I think, to the FBI by an enemy of the Chapitos, a guy called El Mini Lick. And he said, listen, the Chapitos are into fentanyl, they're into methamphetamine, but they're also into extorting. They're particularly extorting the beer business. Like anyone who sells after hour beer in Sinaloa is paying the Chapitos. So they're interested in organized crime as a whole. I'm not sure people like El Mayo are. So I think there is that kind of division.
And that's what you say is the old kind of version of the cartel, and the new is more the Chapitos way of doing it, you think?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that, unfortunately, I think the Chapitos is much, much more popular.
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
Miles he's the last of the old school.
And
Sadly.
how do you think the government feels about that?
Really worried. Really worried.
The government was more in support of the way El Mayo kind of handled things?
Yeah, I mean, people, you can't really say this in Mexico, but I remember distinctly being in Sinaloa in 2018, just when AMLO had got into power. And everyone said, yeah, well, AMLO was here. His men went to see Miles people. And AMLO said, I'm really worried about the growth in drug addiction among young people. Can you make sure fentanyl is not sold in any areas you control? And Mayo put out the order. No one is selling fentanyl in 2 weeks' time. Anyone who does is dead. 2 weeks later, 5 bodies appeared on the main road out of Sinaloa, and no one sold anything. I have a mate who was in charge of drug rehab in Sinaloa, and he said that it went from, like, I don't know, 30 people a day. No one turned up. Right? You can go to Juarez, which is half of it is run by the Juarez cartel, and half of it is run by the Sinaloa. The Sinaloa side, they only sell meth. They don't sell fentanyl. The Juarez side, they sell meth and fentanyl. Because it's really noticeable. I mean, it's clearly an agreement.
Based on your research, what do you recommend policymakers in Mexico or in the United States to address the ongoing drug trade and the associated violence? Like, how can we fix this? What are some ideas you have?
Well, I think basically America has to have a proper medical service. I mean, the problem with what's going on in whether it be California or Oregon or Arizona, with tens of thousands of people on the streets without medical care. I mean, they're people who've just been basically forgotten by society. And unless you kind of try to include them in housing programs, medical programs, psychological care, and it will be expensive and it might not look very pretty, right? And there'll be lots of talk of welfare queens, blah, blah, blah. But in actual fact, that's the only way to sort it out. you'd have to kind of throw money at that kind of thing. In terms of Mexico itself, the thing that I always kind of come back to is they've got to sort out their judicial system. It's a judicial system where 93% of serious crimes are never reported, and only 1.1% of serious crimes are ever solved. You can't run a country like that. That's the core problem. And unless you basically stop letting criminals off, and stop having and basically don't have a functioning judicial system, then I don't see any hope, really. You've got to put people in jail at every level.
Yeah.
And
there's got to be
them.
consequences to actions, or else then it's almost total anarchy.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. I mean, in all honesty, if you murder somebody in Mexico, you'll probably get away with it, sadly.
Jesus.
Depressingly. Yeah. I mean, so what? I think the impunity rate. So in Britain, it's about 60 or 70% of murderers get caught. I think it's probably the same in the United States. It's 1% in Mexico.
This new president in Mexico, do you believe there should be some, how do you see it turning out? Most people I've talked to says she still has the same ideology, so it doesn't seem much change will potentially happen. But some people have more positive thoughts. What do you believe?
Yeah, I mean, this is the tedious academic on, right? It goes, well, it's too early to tell. Right. I mean, in all honesty, yeah, she's very close to the former president, AMLO, and as a result, she's still seemingly very close to the military. No one quite knows why both her and AMLO are quite so reliant on the military. Where I do see some hope, and it might be false hope, is that she has set up her head of public security is a guy called Omar Garcia Harfuch. Now, he was a very successful head of the police in Mexico City who basically halved murder rates in that city. Can he do that in other cities? He's basically been given, he's been told, you're going to look at if you look at those lists of the 30 most dangerous cities, always 20 of them are in Mexico. And he's been given that list of 20 cities, and he's been told, bring down homicides in those cities like you brought them down in Mexico by focusing police in certain areas. You find out the most homicides take place in about 20 streets, basically. Yeah. So he's going to try and do that. And I mean, I personally don't really like the bloke. He has some quite dodgy history to him, but it is an interesting idea. So if you want hope, there's a little bit of it there. You didn't do Borderland for hope, did you?
No, I did it for truth. I did it for truth.
There we are.
Yeah, it doesn't always feel good.
No, that's totally true.
With our current election happening right now, which presidential candidate do you believe will help make, or just in your experience, would make a better decisions on this subject? And you don't have to answer either. I don't. It's
no, I mean, I'm not. I haven't got a dog in this fight. I think where I think I probably differ from most Americans is I'm not terribly impressed with the Democrats either. I mean, if you want to know what the Democrats and the Republicans have done, is they've said to Mexico, we're going to have to basically put up with human rights infringements, drugs coming into our country, as long as you, Mexico, are our border patrol. And for the last 8 years, under both Biden and Trump, Mexico has been the border patrol for the United States. There are more people in deportation centers in Mexico than there are in the United States. They're holding hundreds of thousands of Central and South Americans in appalling conditions. Just last week, there was footage of them shooting 5 Central Americans in the back in Chiapas. It's really, that's the deal that's been done. It's a horrible deal. But the Mexicans basically say, well, the Americans will keep out of our business as long as we do we hunt down migrants for them.
Is there a specific deal that when you say that I can look up further?
Yeah, no, certainly. I mean, it's basically Trump said he was going to raise tariffs on various products coming from Mexico into the United States. And as a result, Mexico agreed to set up deportation centers, and there's now a network throughout Mexico, and try and capture the Central and South American migrants and Kenyan migrants and, Afghan migrants. I mean, now they come from everywhere, Ukrainian migrants, right? Capture them, put them in these deportation centers, send them back. And that's what they're doing.
But we still have a massive influx of immigration. Are those just getting through loopholes, getting through areas?
Getting through loopholes, getting through areas, paying the right people, absolutely no doubt.
Yeah.
But I mean, my suspicion, and I have no direct evidence for this, is Mexico is sitting on 100,000 or hundreds of thousands of migrants going, are you really going to deport people to us? Because we'll just open these deportation centers. Are you really going to put tariffs on our stuff? Because we'll just open these deportation centers. This is partly why America has really not taken out any kingpins in the last 4 or 5 years. Because the Mexicans have told them not to, and have said, if you want to take out kingpins, we'll let migrants in.
Really?
That's the deal.
That's fascinating.
I mean, it's really bleak. I mean, it's really not nice. There's an amazing woman. If you want to look into it, there's an amazing woman called Alethea Fernandez, who's at UNAM, and she's lived for 6 months down in Tapachula on the Guatemala-Chiapas border in one of these migration centers. And they're all now run by the military. There used to be a kind of Institute of Migration. That is now military controlled.
I know that during the Trump era, he had the Remain in Mexico, and I know that the Remain in Mexico doesn't exist anymore once the Biden administration came in. That's one of the things they removed. But I don't know. I didn't know there's deportation locations out in Mexico currently right now. I didn't know there's holding centers.
There are huge networks of holding cells. I didn't realize that. And this is something actually Alethea has been explaining to me. She's very fortuitously actually staying in my university for a year. But she was explaining that basically, yes, the Trump policy has been rolled back by Biden, but de facto it still exists.
Thank you for listening to Borderland and Ironclad Original. See you guys next week.